Card is Richard Jewell. This is a movie that Clint made in 2019. The IMDb plot summary: security guard Richard Jewell is an instant hero after foiling a bomb attack at the 1996 Olympic Games, but his life becomes a nightmare when the FBI leaks to the media that he is a suspect in the case. Directed by Clint Eastwood, starring Paul Walter Hauser, Sam Rockwell, John Hamm, and Kathy Bates. I'll explain why this movie is my wild card, and then we can get more into discussion of the film. And curious to hear your thoughts on it too. But like for me, first of all, I think this is easily one of his best movies he's ever done, and a movie that I do think needs a lot more recognition and discussion. I do think this will stand the test of time. Again, I think it's one of his top five films. Just incredible movie. But the other reason why I think this, for me, is a wild card is very similar to a lot of things we were talking about in Unforgiven. He's questioned his own archetypes, right, of these characters that he's played. And what this movie, I think, is doing is turning it back onto the audience in a way. So Richard Jewell, who's a security guard at the Olympic bombing, this is a true story that happened. I remember when the bomb went off at the
Mhm.
Olympic Games in Atlanta in '96. This guy's a security guard, but he loves law enforcement. Probably because maybe he watched a bunch of Clint Eastwood movies too. Clint Eastwood, in a way, glorifies law enforcement in a sense in his films, and yet that system is turned against him, where the people, his heroes, are out to get him. And what does that look like? What is someone who's been raised to venerate the law? Again, maybe because I've watched a lot of Clint films. How, when the law comes after you, do you realize the law is actually not as great as you think? Do you still want to be in law enforcement? Like wrestling with that moral quandary, I think is really interesting. And the fact that he's turning that back on his own fans in a way, people that love the movies that he made, which again, I think are a lot of venerating law. What happens and how do you handle that? So that is why I think it's very interesting that he's able to bring this back to the audience in a very specific way, or at least that's one of the layers that I read into this film. In a way, this could be a masterpiece for him too. He's made a couple that I think are like close to 10-star movies, and this is one of them. But what are your thoughts on Richard Jewell? And then I'll get to more of my thoughts of the film itself.
I didn't know about the true story when I watched the movie and was completely blown away by it. But I agree, I think it requires a lot more examination. And I think that's pretty brilliant. I didn't think about it that way, that, yeah, Richard Jewell probably grew up watching Clint Eastwood movies and is
Yeah,
enamored by
right.
it. But what comes through, and this is where I think we've not mentioned this so far, is that Clint Eastwood, by and large, is a great casting person as well. Because
Hmm.
guess what? So much of the movies kind of depends on who you have in the movie. And I think this is just like perfect casting. It's a great, I think, surrogate for what Clint has been doing his whole life, like examining real people with true empathy. And here too, like you could argue and say, oh, maybe this guy's like a simpleton or what have you, but there's no judgment from the movie or Clint's point of view. It's very matter of fact. And it's sort of just in front of you. You can make your own judgment just the way the world is as well. So it's
Hmm.
a pretty meta movie of like, oh, are you just like the sad sack person who did this to draw attention to yourself? Or are you just maybe not that bright? Or are you just so earnest that you just didn't see this coming, or somewhere in the middle of all of those things, you know? And it's a great way to pull the audience in, but it's also a great way to explore this character. Because guess what? I think we all have a little bit of Richard Jewell in us, you
Hmm.
know? But then juxtaposing that with media circus and the law enforcement circus, like that is when the movie kind of really takes into high gear. I still can't imagine and believe that this actually happened. It's crazy how the story unfolds. And once again, systems are at question here. And I will say this is the one place where normally, like we've been saying, that even people who are in systems that are maybe not great, they're making poor choices or bad or even good choices. Here, the villains a little bit are cartoony, like Olivia Wilde and John Hamm and all these people, cackling away and what have you. I'm sure there are people like that in media or law enforcement that have done those things, probably, but it's just stands out a little bit in a Clint Eastwood movie because normally the villains are a little bit more layered and textured. So there's not so much of that here.
Yeah,
But maybe it's in service of the story. Maybe this is what happened. I don't know.
yeah, it's really like another layer that sometimes I think about this movie and is similar to that in that essentially, John Hamm's character, who's an FBI agent, who is going to the situation trying to find who the bomber is. Okay, there's some things that maybe point to Richard Jewell being the one instead of it being the hero. He was actually the bomber. And then he starts essentially trying to do whatever he can, push the law to the limits to try to get a confession or something out of him so he can win his case. And that's essentially Dirty Harry. I mean, Dirty Harry goes outside of the law, like he bends the law because he's trying to find the criminal, and it doesn't really matter. And as an audience member, you're cheering that. It's like, yeah, Dirty
Yeah,
Harry. Like, I know you're supposed to read him as Miranda rights, but yeah, rough him up a little bit first. Like, he's the bad guy,
right.
right? And that's happening to Richard Jewell. Basically, Dirty Harry's on him. And now you're looking at Dirty Harry being like, what are you doing? Like, you're a bad
Yeah.
guy. You are, to your point, over the top and trying to railroad this person. And I just wonder again if that's Clint just wrestling with the types of movies he's made before in the past and people that might have cheered Dirty Harry pushing the law enforcement to the limit to get the bad guy is now they're condemning John Hamm's character doing the exact same thing to Richard Jewell. Like he's a bad guy in this, and if it was 1971 and he was playing Dirty Harry, people would be cheering in the audience to try to
Right.
get the guy who did it. I just think that is a fascinating layer as well, and really does play also with the Richard Jewell character. I think is so fascinating is throughout the entire movie, like I said, he's saying yes, sir, to all the law enforcement. He has so much respect and
Right.
veneration for the law. Like that is defines him as a person that keep coming back to this scene in his house. He has a portrait of himself when for a while he was a cop, proud, police officer and his officer photo. There's always just hanging there in the background, just reminding you how much this guy loves law enforcement. He thinks of himself as that. And John Hamm's FBI are just using that almost against him.
Mm-hmm.
The lawyer played by Sam Rockwell is incredible in this. And he's like, okay,
He's
Richard, they're
very good.
coming to your house. They're taking your stuff. Do not say anything. And
Right.
immediately come in, it's like, oh, I'll help you guys out. Like I'm law too. Like anything you need. And Sam Rockwell's like, what are you doing? And it's not because he's a simpleton or an idiot or like doesn't know what's going on. He just he respects the law is like the defining thing about him. And when that's put to the test in this film is what I find the moral quandary in that question of like, what do you do so fascinating? Because in a way, it's like maybe I should just arrest myself then because that is
Mm,
what these guys want, and the law is always right, and
yeah.
the law is always on the right side. So okay, maybe I should just. But he's fighting against the fact that he did save lives. Like he is an absolute hero, like Richard
Right.
Jewell, undeniably what he did to save people from that bombing. He knows that's the truth, and it's like your own personal truth pushed up against your own like moral compass is what I find so fascinating about this
It's
movie.
so deep in that sense, you know. And then I think there's more texture to this, as always in Clint's movies. I think Kathy Bates's character is very important because I think you sort of start to see the cost of all this is not just on Richard Jewell, but it's on her too, just like a normal, innocent family. And now suddenly he's at the center of the circus. And
Yeah,
I think you have to understand the the mother son relationship a little bit more as well, which is shown beautifully to
absolutely.
understand who this person is, right? Because the movie will fall apart if Richard Jewell is not a real breathing person. Otherwise,
Right.
they'll become a caricature, right? But I think that relationship between him and his mother sort of shows you this is not a simpleton. This is
Hmm.
somebody who's brought up with this kind of mindset of like, okay, you believe in these things, and then of course Richard Jewell has kind of added that to his own life, and he's kind of lived by that. I don't know. It made me reflect and think about me and other people that I know, because we all have a certain sincere kind of earnest thing towards something that, okay,
Hmm.
I'm going to do this right. And you, even though your head knows that the world doesn't work this way, you still sort of want to do it. Like, I'm going to meet my deadline because I uphold myself to this standard.
Right.
And I think I'm at least always sort of debating well, how much of that should I keep doing, even though I know that the powers that be all and such don't really care, you know?
Right. Right.
So,
Right.
and that's at the crux of this movie. So this is not just, somebody who feels like a simpleton in like a, not in a tier one city. This is all of us actually.
Right.
And then how the powers that be can come and exploit you and make a circus out of it, you know? I just wish that the bad guys in the movie, quote unquote, just had like a little bit more nuance, because normally you get that in all the Clint movies, and here they're just one dimensional for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, I get where John Hamm's coming from, though. It's like, okay, I think we have our guy. This looks good. Let's just
I
open and
guess, yeah.
shut
I think
case. And same thing with Olivia Wilde. It's like, oh, I have a big story here. She just wants to get the
get
scoop
it.
and not really
Yeah,
about the truth as much as what's the story. But I think your point around that one thing is true. Like for me, I look at it more as like everyone has their own moral compass pointing in a
right.
certain direction, but that's not the same direction for everyone. And you
Yeah.
see that in this movie where Sam Rockwell's like, what are you doing? He doesn't understand that Richard Jewell's moral compass points towards the law needs to be respected and the law will always eventually justice will be served because the law does that. And it goes to the point where he gives a speech at the end of the movie. I love the speech of Richard Jewell's like, I always love law enforcement, but I don't know if I can trust federal law. And then at the very end, he becomes a cop again. And in a
Yeah.
way, you might say, like, these are the people that screwed you. Why would you ever want to go back to law enforcement? Like, that would be if I was writing a screenplay. I'd be like, okay, well, now he throws, like, a lot of scenes, Dirty Harry throws his badge into the lake and he's like, I'm done with you guys. I'm out. The system is too much. He walks away, even though obviously he comes back later. But that would be the scene I'd write if this was a character. But instead, no, he gets tested. The law was actually wrong and trying to go after him. He knows that. It's not like he's a pushover, but he's still that moral compass, whatever his points still due north. And he's like, you know what? I'm still going to be a cop and I'm happy for him in the end. Even though
Yeah.
in a way you should be like, you should hate the law. You should be out there protesting every police and want to get everyone that they've ever put on trial free. That would be, a very easily explainable path. And that's what you'd write as a character. But the real guy, no, real people are more complicated than that. These aren't characters. And I love that ending of this movie where Richard gets to hear the real guy was caught, and there's just this sense of yes, the law does in the end work. This movie, I think, is just
It's
such an
so
incredible film.
moving, to see that he went back. And because guess what? If you truly, truly believe in something, you can't be on the sidelines, pointing fingers at it. You
Right.
have to be in it to drive change. And thank God for people like him, right? That
Mm-hmm.
who are not just like scoffing off and like running away and throwing their badge. They're actually there trying to make things better. Because otherwise, who will?
Mm-hmm.
No outsider can come and do that. It has to be from within, right?
Right.
So pretty amazing. And then the movie is cinematic. The whole bombing scene. Once again, we have like a set piece here, like the
Mm-hmm.
milieu of the place. Like it feels like a movie. Clint was not 40 years old when he made this.
No, 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 no. And the fact that he can still pull this out at that age that he was in, and even something like Juror Number Two is just super impressive. And I love when these guys keep working. We've dealt with a couple of them this year. Again, to middle other different successes along the way, but
Right.
these old war horses still can go out on the battlefield and deliver things. Hi there, it's Alex. If you like the review and discussion Karan and I just had, make sure you subscribe to our channel, Movies That Shaped Us, to get full episodes. Every other Wednesday, Karan and I review a new release and then discuss 6 other movies made by that film's actor or director and how they shaped us. Subscribe right now or follow our podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts via the link in the description below. Hope you join us for the journey.